Tonight, breaking news as we come on the air in the West. Former President Donald Trump found guilty on all counts. Tonight, Donald Trump railing against the verdict.
This was a disgrace.
The jury, 7 men and 5 women, convicting the former president on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records involving the hush money payment to Stormy Daniels. Trump sitting stone-faced in court, shaking his head at times as the jury delivered its verdict. Tonight, when Trump will be sentenced, Dan Abrams is here on what Trump potentially faces. What could the judge decide when it comes to sentencing? And what does this mean for the race for president? The reaction tonight inside Trump's campaign. Aaron Katersky outside the courthouse. Mary Bruce at the White House. Rachel Scott with reaction on the Hill. The other news this Thursday night, the major turn in the war in Ukraine. The Biden administration giving Ukraine permission now to use American weapons to strike inside parts of Russia. Back in the U.S. in the West tonight, the verdict in the trial of doomsday cult leader Chad Daybell, accused of killing his first wife, then accused of killing his new wife's 2 children. What the jury decided. In New York City's Times Square, the harrowing scene tonight. A man attacked with a machete, an area packed with tourists. Tonight, the CDC confirming a 3rd human case of bird flu here in the U.S., where it's been discovered. And we're tracking severe storms at this hour across multiple states, possible tornadoes and damaging winds, and the threat now stretching east tomorrow.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with David Muir.
Good evening as we come on the air in the West tonight. It is great to have you with us here on a Thursday evening for this special edition of World News Tonight. We do begin with the breaking news late today, that stunning moment in American history. The former president, Donald Trump, found guilty on 34 felony counts, the first former president of the United States convicted on criminal charges. The dramatic turn in that courtroom, the judge signaling he would excuse the jurors for the day. Trump was seen joking with his attorney, and then jurors had informed the judge that they in fact had reached a verdict, suddenly changing the temperature in that courtroom. The jurors had been deliberating for nearly 10 hours over 2 days. A short time ago, Donald Trump returning to Trump Tower after his conviction, pumping his fist there, waving at the crowd, some cheering, some booing. Earlier, Trump sitting stone-faced as each of the charges was read, one by one, guilty on all 34 counts. The former president shaking his head at times. Trump reacting immediately, coming before cameras, calling the trial rigged and disgraceful, saying the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. A short time later, Trump seen leaving the courthouse, getting into an SUV to drive back to Trump Tower. He will return to that courthouse on July 11th to be sentenced by Judge Juan Merchan, just 4 days before the Republican National Convention. Dan Abrams is standing by here on what will likely come from that judge. What could this sentence look like? Also, our correspondents with reaction, Mary Bruce at the White House, Rachel Scott on Capitol Hill, and reaction tonight at this hour from inside the Trump campaign and the Trump family. But first, our senior investigative correspondent, Aaron Katersky, leading us off at the courthouse with these dramatic events late today.
Tonight, former President Donald Trump defiant, arriving home at Trump Tower after being found guilty as charged of all 34 counts of falsifying business records. Trump, now a convicted felon. The historic verdict coming after nearly 10 hours of deliberations. A unanimous jury of 12 New Yorkers made Trump the first president in history to be a convicted criminal. It was an extraordinary turn in the courtroom. Just moments before jurors signaled they had a verdict, Judge Juan Merchan indicated he was going to excuse them for the day. Then a dramatic shift. Trump went from joking with his attorneys to sitting stone-faced, looking down as the jury read the verdict count by count. Prosecutors proving Trump falsified business records to conceal a $130,000 hush payment to porn actress Stormy Daniels to keep her story from voters before the 2016 election. The former president then marching out of the courtroom with his lawyer Todd Blanche by his side.
This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
And outside court, cheers could be heard in the crowd as news of Trump's conviction spread.
Guilty! Yeah, man!
The trial lasting 7 weeks, 22 witnesses taking the stand, including Trump's former fixer and lawyer Michael Cohen, who Trump's defense team called the greatest liar of all time. Cohen late today releasing a statement saying today is an important day for accountability and the rule of law. While it has been a difficult journey for me and my family, the truth always matters. And Stormy Daniels in a statement tonight saying no man is above the law. Trump seen leaving the courtroom late today, getting into his SUV, surrounded by security. Judge Juan Merchan thanked the jury for their handling of a very stressful and difficult task, saying you were excused with the gratitude of the court. Court dismissed. The sentencing date for Donald Trump, July 11th, just 4 days before the Republican National Convention. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who brought the charges against Trump, speaking out late today.
The 12 everyday jurors vowed to make a decision based on the evidence and the law, and the evidence and the law alone. And while this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law and doing so without fear or favor.
All right, so let's get to Aaron Katersky, our chief investigative correspondent, live outside the courthouse again tonight. And Aaron, as we were on the air, you reported on this extraordinary shift in temperature in that courtroom. Judge Juan Merchan at first indicated that jurors would be going home for the day, that this would sort of bleed into a third day of deliberations, which ostensibly would be a good sign for the defense team, a good sign for the former president that they had not come to a unanimous decision here. Suddenly, the judge then getting a note from the jury that they had reached their verdict. Can you describe the shift in tone, the sort of whiplash in that courtroom, and certainly what that must have been like for the defense table?
It was really incredible to watch former President Trump joking with his defense attorney, Todd Blanche. At one point, the defense attorney keeled over and laughing, nearly hitting his head on the defense table. He was laughing so hard. Prosecutors, too, sharing pleasantries, laughing with one another. And when the judge returned to the bench saying we're not going home because the jury has reached a verdict, the mood in the room instantly shifted. Everything became much more rigid. Court officers flowed into the room. There was not a sound from the crowd until the jury walked in and rendered its historic verdict, David.
Aaron Katersky leading us off here tonight. Aaron, our thanks to you as always. I want to bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan Abramson. Dan, you and I were talking 2 days of deliberations. We know the judge instructed this jury to make sure you cannot come up with a verdict here, guilty or not guilty, based solely on the testimony of Michael Cohen. You must look at the totality of the evidence. There must be corroborating evidence. They asked about David Pecker's testimony from the National Enquirer to be reread to them, along with other things. And then they came up with their decision, their unanimous verdict, guilty on all 34 counts at the end of day 2. What did that signal to you?
That they clearly believed the corroborating evidence, right? It can't just be about Michael Cohen. So it means that when they were asking to have that testimony reread of David Pecker, they wanted to be reminded, what exactly did he say? In particular, about how this scheme started. According to the prosecutors, this starts in 2015, not in 2016. That's when the effort begins in a meeting with David Pecker, Michael Cohen, and Donald Trump, discussing how to find potentially negative stories about Donald Trump and make sure that they don't see the light of day. Prosecutors made it clear in their closing arguments that that was the beginning of this. When they asked to have that read back, that meant at the least they were following the prosecutor's roadmap.
A couple of quick follow-up questions for you. From a legal perspective, being a convicted felon means nothing in the race for president. He moves forward.
Correct. He can run for president, no question, and he can even vote based on the fact that he's a Florida resident, the conviction's in New York. Florida law says they defer back to the state where it happened. That would mean New York, and in New York, the only way you can't vote is if you're actually serving time as a felon.
Last question, and I think about the viewers at home on this one. We know Judge Juan Merchan is planning a sentencing at this point for July 11th, I believe, which is 4 days before the Republican National Convention. I know legal observers, including you, do not believe any time behind bars is likely here. But what is Judge Merchan, do you think? What's the scope of what we could see here?
It could be anything from no time to up to 4 years. And even if it's no time, the question becomes, are there nuances, right? Could it be home confinement? Could there be probation? Could there be community service? So the judge has enormous discretion here, but most people believe because it's a low-level felony, it will be on the very low end of that.
So we will witness as a country here a convicted felon who is sentenced by a judge to, as you say, potentially home confinement or community service or whatever the judge decides. And that person's still running for president.
Right. And remember, that doesn't mean he's actually serving the sentence immediately after the sentencing. They could actually delay that as they appeal it and potentially not have to serve the sentence until after the election.
Okay. Dan Abrams, who's been with us all afternoon. Dan, thank you as always. I want to get right to our investigative reporter, Olivia Rubin, who has been in that courtroom and also in the overflow room. As we know here in New York, no cameras in court, so we have relied on Olivia and our team inside the courthouse every single day, able to watch themselves as this plays out. And Olivia, you were on the air with me earlier. I thought the dynamic that you described of jurors walking into that room was extraordinary. We'll have to find out in the days and weeks to come if this was something they talked about, whether the foreperson or perhaps the two attorneys who were members of that jury said this is the way we're going to present ourselves. But you described them walking in almost single file, bringing no drama, no emotion, their heads down, very little interaction or even looking at the former president.
Exactly, and Donald Trump, David, as well, stone-faced and motionless, as we have seen for so much of this trial. Hardly any reaction from him, almost detached from the proceedings with the occasional head nod. And of course, after this was all over, what we saw every single day, the jury getting up and filing out of the courtroom in that single file line, just inches away from the former president after they had just delivered his fate in their hands, and many of them looking down, Donald Trump watching, many of them looking at the floor.
And Olivia, our team reporting here that as the counts were read, count one guilty, count two guilty, and down the list, that Donald Trump's reaction at one point, he began to shake his head, but then simply stopped as the number of guilty verdicts rendered on multiple counts here continued to grow.
It appeared at count 4 is when he shook his head. It is the reaction we have seen from Donald Trump so many times. Then, of course, before he left the courtroom, David, Donald Trump standing and adjusting his jacket, looking nervously around the room and making his way out for the last time, David.
Olivia Rubin tonight. Olivia, thank you. Let's get right to our chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl, tonight. John, the race for president. Folks at home, we've seen this in the polling, have said overwhelmingly that they did not want a Joe Biden-Donald Trump matchup. It is what the country is staring down now as we head toward Election Day. The national polls show this is a 1 or 2 point race. In many of the key battlegrounds, Donald Trump actually ahead of Joe Biden. The question going forward, and pollsters are likely going to ask this right away, is does this conviction change any of the minds of those who have said they would vote for Donald Trump?
And David, pollsters have been asking this question hypothetically, saying if Donald Trump were to be convicted of a crime, if he were to be convicted of a felony, would that change your support for him? The overwhelming majority of Trump supporters have said no, but there have been, on average, in polls, including an ABC News poll just a month ago, 20% of voters who say they would support Donald Trump, who would say that they would at least reconsider their support for Donald Trump if he were to be convicted for a felony. If that holds, that could be devastating to his presidential campaign, again, given how close this is. But will it hold? I mean, we just don't know, David. It's important to remember Trump is now, he was indicted on 4 different venues, 2 federal, 1 state, now this one in New York. And each of those indictments actually only helped his campaign. He actually only improved after being indicted. So we'll see what happens now that an indictment has led to a conviction.
John Karl with us as well. John, thank you. I want to bring in our executive editorial producer, John Santucci, who's covered Donald Trump for many years. And John, you have inside reporting from within the Trump campaign, within the Trump family. It's my understanding it was Eric Trump who was in the courtroom today. Other children have been in the courtroom along the way, but noticeably absent Melania Trump and Ivanka Trump.
Yeah, it's interesting, David. Eric Trump has been by his father's side for much of this case, many of the other cases. But of course, his brother Donald Trump Jr. had also been there earlier in the week. Ivanka and Melania have not been present at any of Donald Trump's court cases or any, of course, of his campaign events for this cycle so far. David, tonight I can tell you with inside the Trump family and inside Trump's inner circle, surprise in 2 ways. Surprised at how quick this verdict came down, but not a lot of surprise, David, in what the verdict ultimately was.
At least at the outset, they know there's a positive to this. They have reported that their site has crashed when it comes to fundraising. But then there's the reality in the weeks to come that they have to run with the former president now a convicted felon.
David, and actually just moments ago, my colleague Surin Kim and I learning Donald Trump tonight is actually participating in a fundraiser here in New York. So continuing that push, David.
John Santucci with us. John, thank you. Let's get right to our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce. Mary, you were on the air with me earlier and reported in real time as it was coming to your iPhone reaction from the Biden campaign. We witnessed, and you have reported many nights here, the president seldomly actually even pointing out that Donald Trump was in the middle of this criminal trial, other than to sort of needle the Trump campaign, saying the former president is busy, I hear, in so many words. I paraphrase. Does that tactic change moving forward?
Well, David, we still have not heard directly from the president himself yet, but his campaign says that today shows that no one is above the law. Look, this verdict, there's no question. It is a political gift to Democrats and the president, but his campaign is being careful not to celebrate this too much. They don't want to be seen as feeding into Trump's narrative that this was all something of a political hit job. That's something that the president adamantly rejects. Instead, tonight, in a somewhat muted statement, the campaign says today's verdict does not change the fact that there is still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box, saying convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. David.
All right, Mary Bruce with us at the White House. Mary, thank you. Let's bring in our senior congressional correspondent, Rachel Scott, because Rachel, reaction came in very swiftly from Republicans on the Hill, Republican leaders across this country. They are united behind Donald Trump.
United behind the former president, David, after this verdict today. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, calling today a shameful day, calling this a political exercise, not a legal one. Johnson, of course, one of 37 Republican officials that visited that Manhattan courthouse to show their support for the former president. Even Trump's former rivals, including Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who once said that Trump's indictment sucked the oxygen out of the Republican primary, tonight blasting this verdict. The bottom line, David, this is a Republican Party that has only grown more closer to Donald Trump, even after today's guilty verdict, David.
Rachel Scott in Washington. Rachel, thank you. We, of course, will stay on all of the developments after this historic verdict, but there is a lot of other news to get to, including this machete attack in New York's Times Square, the severe storms in multiple states, and a new case of bird flu here in the U.S. But we start here with the other news and a major turn on Ukraine, a major reversal from the White House tonight. The Biden administration giving Ukraine permission now to strike inside parts of Russia with American-made weapons for the first time. Here's Martha Raddatz.
Tonight, with the Russian assault on Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, intensifying, the Biden administration has made a major reversal, allowing U.S.-supplied weapons to be fired inside Russia. For years, the administration balked at the idea, fearing a strike on Russia itself with U.S.-made weapons could draw the U.S. into direct conflict with Russia. U.S. officials insisting tonight the U.S. weapons will be used only to strike Russian military sites that are being used to launch weapons into Kharkiv. More than a dozen other Western countries have also approved weapons being used inside Russia. But Vladimir Putin already with a threatening response, calling it an escalation, another step towards a serious conflict in Europe and around the globe.
It will be the Pentagon that will coordinate exactly where the weapons can strike inside Russia. But, David, there is no question this is a big change. David?
Martha Raddatz reporting from Washington tonight. Martha, thank you. We turn next tonight to the guilty verdict in the West in a case that made national headlines, the trial of doomsday cult leader Chad Daybell, accused of killing his first wife and then accused of killing his current wife's 2 children. Here's Mola Lengi.
More than 4 years after the murders of his first wife and his girlfriend's children made national headlines, doomsday author Chad Daybell facing his own judgment day.
Guilty.
A jury convicting the Idaho father of conspiring with then-girlfriend Lori Vallow to kill Tammy Daybell and Lori's 2 children, 7-year-old Joshua Vallow and his 16-year-old sister, Tylee. The charred bodies of the kids found in a shallow grave behind Daybell's home.
3 dead bodies. And for what? Money, power, and sex. That's what the defendant cared about.
Lori Daybell is now serving a life sentence. Prosecutors said the couple, who married weeks after the murders, wanted to start a new life and profited from the victims' insurance benefits. Daybell used apocalyptic religious beliefs to justify the murders, claiming the victims had turned into zombies who had to be killed. Well, Chad Daybell's sentencing hearing begins tomorrow when the judge is expected to hear victim impact statements. Again, David Daybell is facing the death penalty.
All right, Mola Lenghi in Los Angeles tonight. Mola, thank you. When we come back here tonight, a harrowing scene in the heart of New York City. A man attacked with a machete in Times Square, packed with tourists, what we've just learned. Also, the new case of bird flu here in the U.S. and where it's been discovered tonight. And these severe storms now moving through this evening, multiple states in a moment. We turn to some of the other news tonight. A harrowing scene in the heart of New York City. Police say a man was attacked by a machete in the heart of Times Square. Authorities say the victim was stabbed in the legs at 45th Street and Broadway, an area packed with tourists. At least 3 people have been detained at this hour. Police believe it began as a dispute between vendors selling items on the street there. Tonight, the CDC is confirming a 3rd human case of bird flu here in the U.S., the 2nd human case in Michigan, in fact. Health officials say all 3 cases now involve dairy farm workers exposed to infected cows. The latest patient has symptoms of respiratory illness. None of the cases are directly linked to each other. The CDC says there's no evidence of the virus spreading from person to person. Tonight, we're also tracking severe storms returning to hard-hit parts of Texas, most of the state at risk for possible tornadoes, damaging winds, and large hail. The threat stretching east tomorrow from San Antonio to Memphis, up to 6 inches of rain possible. In some areas, parts of Texas just can't get a break. Tonight, Walmart revealing customers may have been overcharged at 1,600 stores across the U.S. The company now says customers using some self-checkout machines in March may have paid too much. A spokesperson blames a technical glitch. Walmart tonight saying it is trying to identify affected customers, but saying more than 80% of them have already been reimbursed. When we come back here tonight, an update. The major story of this day, there's already news coming in on Donald Trump and what he's planning next in a moment. Tonight, before we go, the former president is now at Trump Tower here in New York. Tonight, he will now begin campaigning for president as a convicted felon found guilty on all 34 felony counts. A jury of 7 men and 5 women, those jurors selected by both the prosecution and the defense early on. Trump's sentencing is now set for July 11th, just 4 days before the Republican National Convention. We've now learned tonight that Trump will be attending a fundraiser already this evening. Tonight, the Biden campaign saying the verdict proves that no one is above the law. I'm David Muir. I'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thank you for making World News Tonight with David Muir, America's most watched newscast.